Good evening and welcome to the second of our Lent Lectures for 2021. Tonight in the parish of Finchampstead and California, we're joined virtually by our Associate Archdeacon of Berkshire, Liz Jackson. We're very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say on the topic of food. Just a brief reminder, and there'll be more of this at the end of Liz's lecture, that if you have any questions or comments or anything that you'd like to talk to Liz about, and you're watching this lecture on Tuesday the 2nd of March, then do tune in at 9 p.m. for a question and answer session on Zoom. But now, without further ado, here is Associate Archdeacon for Berkshire, Liz Jackson, talking about being excited by food.
Good evening. I want to talk to you about food this evening. Now, I realise that talking about food in a season when we are called to fasting is a potential torture for some of you. You're probably just getting into that Lenten zone when you've stopped fantasising about chocolate or cake or wine or whatever it is that you've given up. Well, I apologise, because actually all of these things will get a mention, and very likely I'll use images of them too, and many other gastronomic delights to illustrate my talk and make it a little more interesting. I was originally asked to talk to you about my passion for social justice. And actually, through talking about food, I will be doing just that, because food and all eating-related issues are about social justice. With every bite we take, we need to, if we don't already, consider a multitude of issues. The growers of the food we delight in, the amount they get paid or don't get paid, the cost of the land that the produce is grown on or grazes on, the impact on the wider environment of our agricultural practices, also the rights and wrongs of exploiting slave labour or cheap labour to bring us unseasonal and exotic foodstuffs, the rights and wrongs of eating non-human animals and our commodification of them. We need to consider those people who are unable to find enough food to eat in countries far away, but also in our own land. We need to think about food banks and free school meals. We need to think about the health impacts to so many in the world who do not get enough calories, enough vitamins, enough minerals to sustain their lives, to flourish and to be healthy. We need to think about those who, through our society's disconnect with the real place of food, are literally eating themselves to death, eating too much, eating the wrong things, eating food lacking in nutritional value. Food is a social justice issue on so many fronts, and I am passionate about social justice. And I am passionate about us getting the world's collective relationship with food right, somehow. We can't talk about all of these issues this evening, so this will be a whistle-stop tour through some of them. Perhaps there'll be another opportunity for a deeper dive into the particular passions of mine, one of which includes veganism. Along with these problems and dilemmas that thinking about food presents, I also want to talk about how bringing about social justice can be facilitated by food. Again, there isn't time to go in depth with many of the different aspects of this, but I'd like to talk to you about how my ministry over the years has addressed issues of poverty and inequality, disconnected communities, and community cohesion through the medium of food. So much to talk about. Shall we start at the beginning? In the beginning, God made heavens and the earth. There was light, there was darkness, there was morning, and there was evening. There was water and sky and land. And the earth produced vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees. There was sun and moon and stars, and there were living creatures to fly in the air, to swim in the waters, and to crawl upon the land. And it was good. And God made human beings, and he said to them, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was good. Then God put a tree in the centre of this paradise he created, and as a loving father desiring the best for his children, he warned the humans that they could eat from any plant, tree, bush, root, fruit that they wanted, except from this one in the middle of the garden. And guess what? Well, we all know. They ate from the tree in the centre of Eden. Did you know that the Latin word for to know or to be wise, sapere, is also used for to taste? There is a connection here, right from the very beginning of creation, between the humans we become, Homo sapien, wise man, and taste. We tasted ourselves into rebellion, into sin, into mortality. We were created to live in paradise, but because of our fall, right at the beginning of time, our relationship with creation, intended to be one of communion, was damaged. And in leaving Eden, we have tumbled further and further into disconnect with the world that God created. We were given good things to eat, and instead of accepting them, and you can read Genesis as a beautiful metaphor for the dawn of humankind and living in harmony with them and the other creatures God put on the earth, we desired more, and we took it without consent and without consideration for the consequences. And the pattern for our human interaction with God's wonderful creation was laid out. We have been taking more without consent and without consideration for the consequences ever since then. This is particularly true of those of us who live in the developed world. Did you know that in poor countries, more than 2/3 of the population works in agriculture? But in the richer countries, it's barely 5%. We have created a disconnect between food, between the very thing that keeps us alive and the God-given, God-blessed world that provides it for us. In the UK, we are told almost 1/3 of primary children think cheese is made from plants, and 1/4 think fish fingers come from chickens. 1/3 of 5 to 8-year-olds thought pasta was a type of meat, and 1 in 10 secondary-aged children think tomatoes grow underground and potatoes grow on bushes. And we can chuckle at this because it's quite funny, but it highlights the growing gulf between the way we live our lives and the very thing that sustains them. And it is this gap that is ever increasing that leads us to the food-related social justice issues that our world is facing today, and, I would argue, the environmental crisis too. Too many people walk into our neatly laid out supermarkets with their shelves laden with every imaginable food and think that they are stocked by some sort of magic hat that pours out endless tins and pots and packets for us to consume. We have forgotten that to produce food requires labour, hard graft, bending and digging and ploughing and sowing. It requires patience, waiting and watching. It requires tending of the earth, and that means land must also rest. We have forgotten, or we choose not to look, that in order for us to eat exotic food, unseasonal food, Our brothers and sisters in different countries must work the land and even sacrifice their land to grow our heart's desires at the expense of their own nutrition. We complain about the price of food, expecting to neither invest our time in labour to eat, nor any more of our money than we need to buy food. The cost of our passion for food is hidden from us. Our unknowing is a social justice issue because what we choose to eat removes the choice from others. Our demand for certain tastes destroys villages and land and habitats and opportunity. We have forgotten the price that others, and the world beyond our own little bit of it, is paying. So, if we go back to Genesis, we have a picture painted for us of God's hope for his creation. In the beginning, it was good. The celestial bodies rose, shone and waxed and waned. The earth brought forth plants and vegetation, and there was harmony. The state of affairs we have created, which forces this beautiful creation to submit to forces of politics and economy rather than season and ecology, is not the world God created. And our passion to consume whatever we want without consideration for the consequences is a significant part of the reason why. As people longing for restoration and reconnection with God, we need to ensure that the choices we make in terms of the food we eat are moral, are ethical, are creation-centric, and are not made in ignorance. Okay, that was really heavy. It really did sound like a lecture, and it wasn't supposed to. But as I said, I am passionate about food. And part of that passion is how our relationship with food fits with our relationship with God and with one another. I want to move on to how food can be part of the bringing in of social justice for all creation. But I wonder first, having looked at the beginning, if we now consider the end. There are numerous references in the Bible to the feast that awaits God's people when all are drawn back into the kingdom. And the language of this feast is as a banquet to which all are invited. In Isaiah, we read that the Lord will prepare a lavish banquet for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine and choice pieces. In Revelation, we read that people will no longer hunger or thirst. And Jesus tells parables in which extravagant parties are thrown, and the best seats at the table are given to the poorest and most despised. Our relationship with food, its necessity to life, its absolute embeddedness in creation, and the joy in sharing and tasting and feasting on food is expressed in these foretastes of heaven. God longs for all to be drawn in, and for all to taste, and for all to be filled, and to have joy and sustenance in his heavenly feast. The disconnect that we have created between the good things God has provided for our nurture and health and happiness is, in the coming of the kingdom, to be reconnected. The gap will be bridged. Now, social justice issues. I do not believe we have to wait for some end of eternity event to be partakers in this heavenly feast. I do believe that when Jesus came and dwelt, God in flesh amongst humankind, and when he said, "The kingdom of God is at hand," he was telling the truth. The kingdom of God was and is at hand. The good things formed in Eden for us to enjoy and to share, that draw us closer into communion with creation and God, are still here. And if we can begin to live as the people we were created to be and are called to be, we can begin to grow that tiny mustard seed of the kingdom we allow ourselves to see into something the whole universe will see and be restored to. And the good news is, God has given us everything we need to draw people into this kingdom. And, you would expect me to say it, part of that everything is food. Now, many of you will go to church, and you will know how well churches do food. Cakes galore, biscuits, shared meals, special meals, sacramental meals. Food is, quite literally, in our church DNA. You will know that sharing food, gifting food, receiving food, cements relationships, gives us common ground, and connects us in a way in which we show one another that we care. You will have a food ministry in your church in more normal times, I am sure of it. Now, I would like to tell you a handful of stories that I hope will encourage you in your food ministry. The first is a story that began in an empty medieval church in a busy city centre. I was an ordinand. That's someone who's preparing to be ordained, preparing to be a priest, training. I was engaged in pioneer ministry, and I'd been asked to find a way to engage this mostly empty church with social justice issues. The job I'd been given had a really strange name. I was the Eucharist animateur. I know, what was that all about? Well, it was a brief based on the Millennium Development Goals. Those are 8 goals the United Nations agreed that international effort should be focused on in the run-up to the year 2000. If you've never heard of them, they include a commitment to eradicate world hunger, to ensure universal primary education, to promote gender equality, to reduce child mortality, to improve maternal health. Let me show you a picture. Here they are. So, this was a job with an overt social justice brief. And part of what I was to do was to engage other churches in education and support to bring about these goals. Now, the Eucharist bit, do you know Bono, the lead singer of U2? You might remember that he is a campaigner for social justice issues and a Christian. And his music runs through with themes of justice. The idea of a Eucharist was to use the music of U2 in a Eucharistic service which had a focus on one or more of the issues raised by the Millennium Development Goals. In all honesty, I'm not sure how well that bit of the project worked. But back to that empty church. The coordinating group for the services met on a Tuesday evening in this very old church. And one cold and windy Tuesday evening, we were chatting about inequality and how to engage people who were largely doing okay with such issues, when the door rattled and a young man came in, bundled up with an oversized anorak, plastic carrier bags hooked on the fingers of one hand, and a sleeping bag under his arm. He asked if he could come in, and then if his friends could too. And 4 very cold, damp people came into the church that night, and they had a cup of tea with us, and we went out and bought fish and chips too. Sometimes God just gives you the nudge you need, doesn't he? Over the next few weeks, as the winter became colder and wetter, more and more people joined us in the church on a Tuesday evening to talk about the worldwide problems, but actually just to talk about their own problems too. Those of us who made the tea realised quite quickly that there were problems of inequality and poverty very close to home. Over the next 3 years, the church became firstly a place where hot meals were served in the evening, then a day centre for people who were homeless, and for 6 months a winter night shelter for particularly Eastern Europeans who at that time were not eligible for benefits and so could not access other homeless provision. That all started with a cup of tea, some fish and chips, and the offer of a seat at a shared table. Without the offer of food, the engagement would never have happened. Without the consumption of food, the trust would not have developed. Without the ongoing provision of food, the 400 or so people who engaged with the project over its 3-year life would not have been supported. For some of them into accommodation, for others into addiction support, or for more than it should have been, into simply an easing of a wretched situation that just didn't ever seem to get better despite the efforts of the several support agencies that worked alongside us. The second story began in a run-down city centre church again, but a different one. And this time, the food was baked potatoes. As a church, we had begun to serve lunches for those in our community who struggled to find food, shelter, company, whatever. The sitting around a table was a great way to break down barriers and to offer conversation and companionship. As time went on, the numbers coming for lunch grew. We offered lunch 5 days a week, and other activities happened in the church that drew people in. We had a work club, a volunteer programme. We offered English lessons to people whose first language was not English. And while our reputation at being able to engage people in the community and offer a safe place grew, and we were asked... After a while, our reputation at being able to engage people in the community and offer a safe place grew, and we were asked by the council to work with them on the resettlement of Syrian refugees. Now, about 40 new Syrian refugees were arriving in the city every 3 months, and we worked with the local authority and other partner organisations to develop a programme which included a welcome when the plane landed, breakfast, support for settling into their first home, furniture, clothes, and so on. And then we helped in the learning of English and other skills. Our offer to these newly arrived refugees grew, and we were able to employ staff to help them find volunteer placements in the city, and then help with looking for employment. And as you would expect, one of the best ways of engaging with people who you did not share a language with was through food. So some of the language classes we ran in the evening included a meal. We brought in fish and chips and other English classics, and then we began to find that the refugees themselves were bringing in food for us to share. So we tasted tabbouleh and fattoush and falafel. And in the sharing of food, we were able to find ways to communicate and to laugh and to connect. And as we engaged with the Syrians, and by then other refugees and asylum seekers, and as they settled and began to gain confidence, they were desperate to find work and be productive. Many had been chefs or cooks in either Syria or in Lebanon whilst they waited to be granted refugee status, and they were keen to pick this up. So we developed a food hygiene course that was delivered in a hybrid of Arabic and English to make sure that they had the necessary knowledge and skills to be able to work in UK cafes and restaurants. We used the kitchen in church to practice. Now you will have heard the saying, "You are what you eat." And I think this is very true. What you eat speaks of the country you come from. Food that is found in hot places or wet places. It speaks of the care you take of yourself. If you eat junk food, you will not be as healthy as if you eat fresh food. It speaks of your financial situation. Extravagant and expensive food is only eaten by the wealthy. It speaks of your ethics. If you choose perhaps organic, cruelty-free food, it may mean you are more alert to environmental considerations. It speaks of your ancestry, your family recipes, traditions, the country of your origins, flavour preferences. You are what you eat, and what you eat shows to a very large extent what you are to the world. You are what you eat also demonstrates your connection to a world beyond yourselves. The diets of all the plants and the animals that fed the chicken, that laid the egg, that is served up on your plate, are connected in every mouthful you eat. the soil that grew the plants, the water that watered them, the labourers that harvested and collected, the transport workers that carried, are all connected to you through the food that reaches your plate. And their stories matter. One of the things we discovered, talking with people from all over the world, was that they wanted to share their food culture and the story that it told with us and with others. They wanted to be hospitable to the people who had shown them hospitality. They wanted to talk of aubergines growing in the Syrian sun or gardens full of parsley that they harvested in Iraq. They wanted to share their precise combinations of flavours and spices with their new neighbours. And as they shared, they wanted to remember who they were and teach us something of that too. All of this food encounter and food thinking was happening as people were welcomed into a new city. And sometimes not welcomed. We discovered, as did the people who were refugees, that not everyone wanted to welcome them. And often there were racist attacks, racist words, and sometimes protests at their presence. With optimism, though, our new friends still wanted to reach out. And we hit upon an idea. We wanted to start a restaurant. If we had discovered anything about food ministry, it was that it was a brilliant way of bringing people together. It is a brilliant way of breaking down barriers. And so we found a spare kitchen and a spare restaurant, and we negotiated an extremely low rent. We hired 2 Syrians and 2 Iraqis. 2 were Christian and 2 were Muslims. We got some seed funding from a Jewish charity, and we opened for business, and people poured in. We served Arabic mezza, and we made it vegan, which helped with the need to be both halal and kosher. Behind the scenes of the kitchen, we taught English, and then helped people get through food hygiene qualifications so that they could work in the kitchen as volunteers, getting invaluable work experience that led them into real employment after their placements ended. We catered for some huge events, sometimes 600 people. And then it really was all hands on deck, including me, the vicar, chopping onions and garlic, and then delivering food in a dog collar. We were asked to cater for an event with the Archbishop of Canterbury too, as well as a number of politicians. And the thing about Arabian Bites and the food we served is that it was so much more than sharing food culture. It was so much more than learning about one another. It was barrier breaking and community building. It was impossible to sit down across the table with someone and not talk and smile. Well, it's not impossible, is it? But it's pretty uncomfortable if you try. And in giving such a public platform to our refugee neighbours, we were able to show their humanity, find the commonality and demonstrate their desire to be part of their new city. Food breaks down barriers. I would love for you to hear some of the story of our restaurant, Arabian Bites, from the people who worked there. Have a look at this.
Hello, my name is Simon. Welcome to Arabian Bites. I hope you are excited to have some delicious food with us.
My name is Ahmed. I'm from Syria. I live in Coventry. I am working Arabian Bites. This falafel, chickpeas, coriander, garlic, onion, and oil and fire in here. لأني بحب الطبخ.
He likes cooking because his friend teach him how to cook, and he helps his wife at home when they have guests around to visit them, and cooking is one of his hobbies, so he likes cooking too much.
My name is Mohammed Najjar. I am from Syria. I came here about 3 years ago. I came from Lebanon. When I arrived in Coventry, and I like my job, make 2 volunteers with the refugee, the council. When I made more things from Syrian food, the English people like, and I like to make something for in UK, for my country. I'm happy, too happy, because all the customers, when they come here, try and eat from Arabian Bites foods, they come back and they were happy, too happy, and thanks us about the foods, the amazing food.
Hello, my name's Liz Jackson. I gave birth to the idea of Arabian Bites about 18 months ago. We started the project as a pilot in a borrowed kitchen in a church in the centre of Coventry, and now we're based inside another building that we're given permission to use, and we're open as a restaurant in the evenings and during the daytime. The story behind Arabian Bites is that Coventry is one of the cities that takes the largest number of Syrian refugees in the country, and what we wanted to do was be able to demonstrate that these guys come with skills, and we wanted to give them the opportunity to share their food culture with the people of Coventry.
My name is Martin Moma. I come from Iraq. I've been in the UK for 2 years now. I started working since the beginning of the project. It's over a year now. If I have to recommend any dishes, well, basically all of them. To be honest, my favorite one should be the feta, because it has this taste of like hot and cold at the same time, and the fried bread and the cashews that are fried and after that almost like burnt with oil. If I'd rather choose somewhere else, I'm not gonna choose any. Like, I've been in different places in the UK, but every time I go somewhere or even abroad, I just miss Coventry. It's like a home to me now. The basics that we like is steak bakes and all that. I've tried them, delicious. But the one thing that I didn't like is the British breakfast. It's quite horrible to mix like the beans with the like you know the hot dogs and all that, and with the bacon and or the pork or all that all together. Like, it's just like mixed up. So I need it to be a little bit separate.
I feel really privileged to work in the environment and with everybody that I do. It's great working with all of the guys. It's really fun. We all bounce off each other and have a really good time making delicious, delicious food.
In terms of the future for Arabian Bites, it's our hope that we can become better known, that we can reach more people with this amazing Arabic food, amazing Arabic meze across Coventry and across Warwickshire, we hope. That more and more people will come and experience the food and support the newly arrived refugees that are coming into the city.
I don't know, how do you mix the beans with eggs and all that all together, and after that, how do you eat it? It should be mixed up inside, not while you're eating it.
So, food, my passion, a social justice issue and a vehicle to engage with social justice issues, and a way to minister with the people you find yourself in the middle of as you labour to bring in God's kingdom. I feel that I've only skimmed the surface of all that can be said about food, and there really isn't much time left to say more. But perhaps one more point of reflection. We are followers of the God who became man and said, "I am the bread of life." Jesus said this in John's Gospel after a food-related miracle. Faced with thousands of hungry people and with almost nothing to hand, Jesus fed them bread and fish. He fed them enough that they were full and could not even eat all the food he produced. We are told that 12 baskets of food were collected up at the end of the meal. Jesus satisfies the temporary, real hunger of people with real food. And they are so amazed, so whipped up by what he did. We are told they wanted to force him to be their king. Who wouldn't want a king that could provide food on demand? So Jesus left with his disciples to a safer place. But the people who had been filled were still hungry for a king, and they began to search for him. And they find him on the other side of the lake. And they ask Jesus for a sign. Bread and fish clearly on their minds as they remind him that Moses was able to feed the people every day whilst they journeyed through the wilderness. These people before Jesus, who came from a place where they would have known gnawing hunger, were ready to make him their king and follow him, if only he would feed them. Jesus does not repeat the miracle. Instead, he tells the people gathered there that he is the bread of life. He is the only bread they will need. He tells them that if they eat and drink him, this man stood in front of them, they will live forever. We are told that some of those who wanted him as their leader, some of the disciples, found this too hard to deal with and they left him. And those disciples who stayed followers of him, after hearing these challenging, impossible to understand words, would go on to journey with him into Jerusalem, where he was hailed a king, and then eat with him at the Last Supper, when he shared real bread and real wine with them, but called them his body and his blood. And then they would watch him die. When Jesus talked of his followers consuming his body, which we do symbolically in communion, he was telling them that he would nourish them spiritually, yes, and spiritual hunger is as desperate as physical hunger, but also that by taking his body into our own, in the intimate act of eating, we allow Christ to abide with us, in us. You are what you eat. If you eat the bread and the wine, the body and the blood, this symbolic meal that feeds our souls, we live differently. We become different people. As Paul writes to the Galatians, it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. When we feed on Jesus, we are challenged to relate to others in a new way. We do not relate to them to suit our own personal need and for our own satisfaction. Instead, we join in the body of Christ in welcoming and forgiving and healing and reconciling and feeding. In allowing Jesus to be our host, the host, at the Lord's Supper, we are invited to join him in being hosts in creation. Eating in this sacramental sense is transformative for us and for the world. And again, it is the work of bringing in the kingdom. We ourselves become the nutritious food that offers hope and healing and sustenance to the world.
Well, a huge thank you to Liz for that amazing lecture. I'm sure we're all very excited to reconsider our eating choices because of it. Now, we are delighted that at 9 p.m. today on Tuesday the 9th of March, we'll be joined by Liz for a question and answer session. The details for the Zoom link will be coming up in just a moment. Do please join us for that if you have any questions or comments for Liz. Just a reminder as well that there is an option to donate to the parish in response to these Lent lectures if you're able to. Anything that you're able to give is gratefully received. Do please join us next week, which is the 9th of March, for the third of our Lent lectures, which will be given by myself. I'm Reverend Gemma Donnell, and I'll be speaking about my excitement about silence, which I promise will be more than just 30 minutes of quiet. But perhaps not that much more. You'll have to join us and find out. We'll see you next week. Thank you.